and today we get to discuss what the schizophrenia spectrum disorders are. Previously, all of the different schizophrenias were listed very separately. Now they're kind of all jumped together into a basically just one disorder, and they just call it schizophrenia spectrum because there is a spectrum of problems that they may show, symptoms they may show, and so let's get just to that. So when you think of schizophrenia, what kinds of characteristics come to mind? There are a lot of things people might come to mind that relate to schizophrenia. A very common one is some type of hallucination. They do have those. Other people tend to think that they might have some type of split personality, that type of thing. I've heard that a lot, although that's not really part of schizophrenia. That is a separate disorder. So some people might think that they have those separate personalities because they might talk to somebody who may not be visible. So I suspect that might be a huge factor in that. But there are actually a lot of different characteristics. So let's show something from the perspective of somebody with this disorder.
You're so dumb. Don't get up. You're good. Don't do anything. Stop what you're doing. Don't do anything. Just stay in your bed all day. Your head up. You are good. Hi, I'm Michelle. You're so dumb. Don't get up. You're good. Don't do anything. Stop what you're doing. Don't do anything. Just stay in your bed all day. Your head up. You are good. Hi, I'm Michelle Hammer, and I have schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a mental illness that changes the way you think, feel, and act. It's broken down into 3 separate categories: positive, negative, and cognitive. Positive symptoms don't mean they're a good thing. It's an add-on to your normal behavior. Things like hallucinations, delusions, and voices.
You know, I had so many ghosts and shadows inside of my mind.
A demon was perching on the end of my bed.
Negative symptoms take away from your behavior.
I showed no emotion and I was just totally out of it.
Cognitive symptoms make it hard to pay attention and hard to focus.
Their brain is just racing. They can't stop.
The pathology of these illnesses has only become recently understood.
Schizophrenia is different for everyone. My symptoms aren't like everybody else's. My first symptoms of schizophrenia was pretty much just zoning out, thinking I was in a different place. Then it turned into kind of voices in my head that just plagued me over and over again. I thought my mother was trying to hurt me. I didn't know what to do about anything because I thought everyone had it out for me, so I didn't know who to go to for help. Sometimes I kind of hear a voice more coming from the right side of my head saying, like, everyone hates you, stop what you're doing, don't do anything, nothing. Well, it's kind of like the other side of me is kind of arguing back with the voice. Don't worry about anything, chill, just chill, breathe, chill, just chill, you can get through it. And it's kind of just like the thing is, who's gonna win, who's gonna win, who's gonna win? When I take my medicine, the good sign wins. I mean, living in the city and having schizophrenia is interesting just because, you know, I do hear voices as I'm walking down the street. So in my head, I'm thinking of the person talking to me, but then I start talking back to the person. And then maybe I'll snap out of it, look around, and like 5 people are staring at me. But mostly I kind of just get plagued by thoughts that are just so repetitive in my head, and they just go around over and over and over again, when really I just want it to be nice and quiet and silent. All through high school, I had this like really crazy paranoid delusion that my mother was trying to kill me. Every time she went to try to get me to a therapist or anything, because she knew something wasn't right, I always thought she was trying to ruin my life. So when I went to college, I thought I was free of her, and everything was great, and then all of a sudden, my best friend, my roommate, I started thinking the exact same things about her. So realizing that I had the problem was like the start of the entire thing. And that was the hardest thing to do, I think, realizing there was a problem. At 18, I was told I was bipolar, but I kind of knew that diagnosis was incorrect. So at 22, I spoke to a different doctor, and I was more honest with him, and he diagnosed me with schizophrenia, and that was like the best thing that ever happened to me because he got me on the right medication, and I feel as good as I can possibly feel right now.
I finally told a therapist about what was going on with me. I had all these problems, and I finally had a name for them.
Over time, we've realized that mental illness is nothing more than physical illness. Talk to as many people as you can. Don't be ashamed. Don't be judgmental.
I see a psychiatrist every other week, and we just kind of talk about things that are going on. Mostly I just share really silly stories with him, and we just laugh a lot, when really he's measuring just my mood. And that's what I know that he's doing. For my medication, I take 7 daily medications, 6 in the morning and 1 at night. The ones in the morning just get me ready for the day, get me focused, make it so I can get out of bed without having a horrible day. And the 1 at night just keeps me kind of level, knocks me out, and lets me have a good sleep without completely panicking in the middle of the night.
It can be very lonely having schizophrenia. The paranoia, the fear, the voices, everything that goes along with it.
The compliance with medications is going to ultimately lead to a recovery, and your son or daughter can not only be okay, but they can be great again.
It took a process of almost 10 years to get me on the right medication, so I'm glad that I finally am. People think that just because you're on medicine that the voices will completely stop, but you just can't stop the voices. With medication, it's more positive listening, it's more just zoning out. As long as I'm not thinking of negative, horrible things,
My soul was leaking out of my body. I just saw a human being empty.
I'm good. So you can't turn the voices off, you can just make them to what you prefer to hear.
Be conscious of something that will take your attention from that negative situation into a positive one. And it takes a lot of discipline, but little by little, it becomes a habit.
1 in 5 New Yorkers has a mental health issue, but people don't talk about it because of all the stigma.
There's still a lot of stigma, but people are starting to understand it a little bit better.
Kind of like a big reason why I started my clothing line was that I was on the subway and I looked down the subway train and there was a homeless schizophrenic guy just talking to himself, and I noticed it was in the same exact mannerisms as I do it. So I kind of thought to myself, what's the difference between me and this guy? And I realized if I didn't have my friends, my family, my doctor, I could so easily be in his position. Part of the reason I started my whole business was to just tell everybody that I have schizophrenia. Showing people you can live a completely normal life, medicated, and be a completely normal person. And my whole thing is, if everyone would just kind of tell people that they have a mental illness, there wouldn't be so much stigma. There really shouldn't be any stigma. That needs to go away. Mental illness is so common. How can there be so much stigma? So I kind of wanted to do something that could raise awareness, give back to the mentally ill homeless community, and just kind of make a difference.
Hi, how are you guys doing? Schizophrenic NYC was all made by me, schizophrenic New Yorker, trying to change the way New York City sees mental health, especially the mentally ill homeless. Donate a portion of the profits to help them out. Yeah.
I just pack up my bag, I wheel it over to my shop every Saturday, and I just sell my merch and I talk to amazing people. Yesterday I met 2 people that work in a psych ward. We had the greatest conversation about psych wards. They totally bought something for me and they took my card and they're like, we love what you're doing, this is so great. You know, mental health professionals love what I'm doing, they always think it's great. I've gotten negative reactions, like one lady came up to my booth last year and says, I can't believe you would name a business this. This is offensive, and I'm a mental health advocate. This is offensive, and she took my flyer and ran away. And I was like, can I tell you about it? I'm a mental health advocate too. And she just ran away, and I was like, isn't that stigma? Aren't you judging me before I even tell you about it? Stigma right there.
This shirt's pretty awesome. It's not a delusion. You are incredible.
Some common questions that I get is, what medications are you on? Mostly by people in the mental health field, they want to know. Other common questions are like, how to handle somebody in a crisis. I mean, definitely never tell them that they're wrong. Don't try to take away their feelings. You always have to be sympathetic. I would try to convince them that they should seek professional help. Find a good doctor, find the meds that work. If you try hard enough and you really want to fix it, you can. Don't take your medication, feel better, and then think you don't need your medication anymore. It took a lot of pride that I had to say, I need medication, and I'm just gonna take it.
My advice to someone who's going through it is be honest. If you keep telling people you're fine, they'll believe it.
I believe.
So that is a remarkably, remarkable and special woman. A lot of people with schizophrenia, unfortunately, are not nearly as successful as she is. The comments that she made about finding the med that works for you and, staying on it. Unfortunately, a lot of people with this disorder will go off their meds, and it ends up not being very good for either them, their friends, their family. And this woman is, I think, is doing a pretty remarkable job at what she's doing or what she's trying to do, especially for the homeless people who have mental illness, who are very, very stigmatized, and they can't get the help that they need, even if they want to. And now we have a little bit of an activity, and this is true or false. So you can play along. True or false? Schizophrenia is a rare illness. Schizophrenia is actually relatively common. About somewhere around 1 in 100 people have suffered or do suffer from a schizophrenia spectrum disorder. Number 2, schizophrenia is a brain disease. If you said true, you are correct. We don't know all of the details about how schizophrenia is working. People are studying it. I almost brought some of the information in to discuss that, but I realized that it would probably push me over time, and it's probably not suitable for an introduction to psychology course. But we can all agree that schizophrenia is at least a disorder, not so much a disease, but a disorder of the brain. 3, schizophrenia usually strikes older people. True or false? If you said that it was false, you're correct. Although I suppose it depends on what you define as older. Most people in Introduction to Psychology are in their late teens or very early 20s, and generally, if somebody has a schizophrenia spectrum disorder, they probably will start showing up in their teens, their 20s. Most people do have their diagnosis or whatever by around 30. there are a few people that do come in after that. My first stepmother was, I believe, diagnosed when she was in her very early 30s. True or false? More males than females develop schizophrenia. So the answer to this is false. Realistically, the sex is somewhere balanced between males and females, although there is a tendency for males to be diagnosed earlier and for females to be a little bit more likely to talk about it. So there's that. Schizophrenia is caused by poor parenting. True or false? If you said false, you're correct. There are a lot of things that we're looking at for schizophrenia. We know that there's a genetic component to schizophrenia. There is some form of environmental component as well. And, but as far as we can tell, poor parenting does not seem to be one of those factors, although it was believed to be the ultimate cause of schizophrenia many, many years ago. But we know that we now know that there really doesn't seem to be anything to that. So now we're on the next page. True or false? Schizophrenia is caused by street drugs. For the most part, this is false. Street drugs don't specifically cause schizophrenia. However, there is at least one drug that is linked to an increased chance of showing schizophrenia, and that would be marijuana. When with marijuana, when you smoke it, ingest it, or whatever you do with it, it tends to release every neurotransmitter in the brain. One of those, dopamine, high enough amounts of dopamine are linked to schizophrenia. So that's basically the only real one that has a real link. And one joint is probably not going to do it. I don't know that for certain, but it has to be something that basically is that constantly high influx of dopamine, which seems to be linked. So if somebody is on that very, very border of developing it or not, they just have that susceptibility, I would recommend that they be very mindful of what they're ingesting into their body, particularly marijuana. True or false? People who have schizophrenia are usually violent and dangerous. Most people who have schizophrenia are not violent or dangerous, so the answer is false. Now, that does not mean that people can't become violent or dangerous, but it isn't typical. Number 8, people with schizophrenia have multiple or split personalities. The answer to that is false. I actually believe I spoke about that at the very, very beginning of this. But I'm pretty sure you actually cannot have both that diagnosis, schizophrenia that is, and any of the multiple personality disorders. In fact, this concept of multiple personalities or anything like that is actually incredibly rare. So statistically, it wouldn't be likely even in the best situation. True or false? Schizophrenia can be successfully treated. The answer to that is true. Now, while there is absolutely no cure for schizophrenia, there are several drugs on the market that can really help keep that under control. People with schizophrenia are developmentally disabled, i.e., they have a low level of intelligence. You said false. You are correct. Usually, the people with schizophrenia have normal intelligences or even above average intelligences. So they don't tend to be developmentally disabled. So this concept of this diagnosis of schizophrenia, until relatively recently, it was subdivided into several categories: paranoid, catatonic, disorganized, residual, and undifferentiated. I believe it started in the DSM-5, because I do not believe it was this way in the DSM-4. They changed it to a more broad spectrum of schizophrenia and schizophrenic disorders, which is the title of this lecture. And with these, you must have 2 of the following for at least 6 months: hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech, strange behavior, or be withdrawn and lifeless. Several of these do map on somewhat to the prior diagnoses, such as somebody with paranoid frequently would have had the hallucinations and delusions, while catatonic might be withdrawn. So this simplified things at least a little bit. So let's discuss some of these symptoms of schizophrenia. One of the things we probably should discuss is what are called positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Now again, this isn't really a quality judgment saying, oh, this is good, positive is good or negative is bad, at least not necessarily. Positive, usually, just like in learning, is referring to an addition of something. So an additional thing that other people might not have, while negative is something that people would have but now isn't present. It's kind of disappeared. So to discuss, so I wanted to mention that as we start to discuss things like delusions. Now, a delusion is a false belief that is hard to change, even when somebody is presented with conflicting information, just like on this slide. Now, these are considered a positive symptom of schizophrenia because most people won't necessarily do that this isn't an added on thing to what would otherwise be considered normal. So a delusion could be someone thinking they're Jesus. If you go to Israel, apparently when people go to Jerusalem, a whole lot of people decide that they are Jesus. And they start to have that delusion. And it can be very confusing and distressing, I'm sure, to a lot of other people. I think the Israelis are most likely used to it. But this is one of those things. Even though they've tried proving to people that they're not Jesus, he's passed away, they still hold on to that. In the video we watched earlier, she was saying that her mom or whatnot was trying to hurt her, trying to kill her. I really doubt mom was trying to do any of those things. They were, that was just a sign of a delusion. Let's see here. So other things that could be delusions or potentially feeling like you're unstoppable, that type of thing. That you can jump from a tall building. Well, you can do that. You might not survive it, but you, I suppose, could do that. But nothing really changes this whole situation. You just can't convince them otherwise. Types of delusions, some of which I've already given examples of. Here's one. Here's the persecutory. Someone's trying to hurt or harm you, like the person's mom my stepmother thought my father was trying to kill her, even though he wasn't present. So that was one type of hallucination. There's this grandiose one that can go along with the thing of feeling like you're Jesus. That could also be the special powers, like like as I mentioned before, you're able to jump off of a building, or you can stop a speeding bullet. Yeah, you can do that. You can only do that once. So those are some examples of that type. Reference is basically that certain events have some type of special meaning. I have this friend who is convinced every time a clock shows 11:11 that I think that it was a sign that somebody was sending her a message. In her case, it was relatively safe. I think it might have been linked to a relative that she lost, but she feels that that's really, really meaningful for her. There are other examples. I had in one of my other positions, I had a cluster of photos that came in from this one person and asked me to talk to her. And she said that somebody was writing in the clouds, aliens, I believe, is what she said. And to everybody else, they look like normal, everyday clouds, no writing, nothing even similar to any of that. But she believed that someone was writing to her. She had thousands and thousands and thousands of pictures of these clouds, and they're beautiful clouds, but none of us could figure out what was supposed to be in them. But the clouds had something for her. This whole concept of thought insertion, I'm sure a lot of people are aware of maybe some people, you see this in pop culture, I suppose, where people think the government might be trying to change their thoughts, so they have to wear tinfoil hats or whatever like that. That whole thing is this concept of thought insertion. This fear that others are controlling their thoughts. Another thing is this concept of hallucinations. These can be a positive hallucination or negative hallucinations, although generally we are referring to them in schizophrenia. I'm sure they can have negative hallucinations, but we mostly hear about the positive hallucinations. Again, remember, this is not a value judgment. Positive just means they're seeing something that isn't there. Likewise, a negative hallucination would be when you're walking around with your phone in your hand and you can't find your phone because it's in your hand. Your mind's just blocking that out. That would be an example of a negative hallucination. So basically that's what that type of thing is. If anybody's ever seen a spirit, well, that could potentially be a hallucination as well. Types of hallucinations. Auditory, that's basically anytime you might hear somebody, maybe someone call your name and find out that nobody called you. That can be really creepy if you're home alone. There's also visual, like I just mentioned. If you saw a ghost, that might fall under visual hallucination, unless we can prove that ghosts really exist. You can also have, a smell-based hallucination. My stepdaughter at one point was obsessed with the smell of coffee. She thought there was coffee in the house. There was no coffee in the house because I don't use it, I don't drink it, I do nothing with it. So she had that. It was very unusual. Other people I know sometimes might smell maybe their grandmother's perfume, even though nothing is around. That could potentially be a hallucination. Taste-based, that's what that one is. Kind of unusual, but it does pop up from time to time. and somatic, which is generally some form of touch-based hallucination. This can happen. Sometimes maybe you feel someone tap you on your shoulder and you turn around, there's nobody there. Maybe something else happened, but that can actually be kind of concerning. I didn't know you could have a touch-based hallucination until I had one, and I kind of freaked out. It was really, really weird. So be aware of all of that. So here is a joke. I always like giving a joke. Here's one. A concerned mother checks her son into a mental hospital after he traded the family cow for some magic beans. "Ma'am," the doctor said with a look of sympathy, "I'm afraid your son has a strong case of schizophrenia." "Oh, good Lord, I knew there was something wrong when he insisted those beans were magic," the mother said, wiping a tear from her eye. "Well, no, it's not that. The beans actually are magic," the doctor replied. "Well, then how do you know he's schizophrenic?" The doctor took a deep sigh and said, "Well, ma'am, you see, Jack and the beans talk." Okay, there. So another sign of schizophrenia is this real concept of really weird, disorganized behavior and disorganized speech. And it is something that definitely needs to be shown first. So with the next video, you may need to turn up the volume because it is pretty quiet, even for me who's listening to it as well.
Tell me, why did you come to the hospital?
To teach.
To teach? What do you teach?
Toilet training 1 years.
Have you started teaching here at the hospital?
3 urine tests.
Pardon?
Urine tests.
Tell me, why did you come to the hospital?
To teach.
To teach? What do you teach?
Toilet training 1 years.
Have you started teaching here at the hospital?
3 urine tests.
Pardon?
Urine tests.
What were you doing before you came to the hospital?
I was studying biorhythm.
Here in Bloomington? Or were you in another city or in another state?
ST. I opened the tea bags.
Have you been hearing voices telling you to do things?
I know what the voice box is used for.
Can you tell me?
Hot and cold.
What does that mean? I don't understand.
Through air conditioning.
What?
Her vocal cords were used straightforward.
Do you sometimes feel as though you're a robot?
That is a Jehovah's Witness, yes.
Is it? Can you read people's minds?
Blueprints only.
Where do you get the blueprint?
From filling applications.
Can you tell what people are thinking without them actually saying it?
IT?
Hmm?
I never have done that. That.
It? That? Well, have you ever heard your thoughts broadcast, as though they were coming over a loudspeaker or over a television?
Mike.
A mic?
Mike.
Okay, tell me about that.
2. Mike is 2. Girl's 14.
Do you feel people put thoughts into your mind?
This feeling of thought process is eliminated now. Was woman's active political party.
Are you a religious person?
And religious means to wear glasses or spectacles.
Has anyone ever put thoughts into your mind?
Only the television.
When? Can you tell me about that? When the television does that?
No.
How is the television able to do that?
They have very intricate tools.
And they can put thoughts into your mind?
It's possible.
What was happening in the week or two before you came to the hospital?
Well, the thing I regretted the most was quitting my job because my family got upset and brought me to the hospital.
Why did you do that?
Some voices were telling me I could have either 2 rounds or 4 rounds. And I didn't know whether they were talking about clocks or what time it was or anything.
So how did you decide to quit your job?
Because of the pig. Like, white light is pure, right? Well, I was fighting Manson. I guess that's it.
So when you quit your job, your parents got upset, and that's how you ended up here? Did someone call your family, or did you come in by yourself?
Well, they were tuned in on me all the time.
Who was?
My parents, I guess.
So they knew what was going on even before it happened?
Probably.
So when it actually happened, no one had to call them. They knew what happened already, and they just came in and got you?
No. I was driving my dad's car, and the police stopped me down there by Man Road. It was scary.
Why, were they rough on you?
Yeah. Not too rough, though.
How long have these voices been telling you about round 2 and round 4? And how long has Charles Manson had an effect on you?
It's just been in the last month, 'cause I went to some friends' house, and I saw I went next door and I saw this guy who was going to be a computer programmer, and this girl said her uterus was out of place. And I said, Well, you must have a sugar daddy or something. You know? I guess it's all right. Everybody's got to survive.
How did that affect you?
Made me think back to my own girlfriend. That's why I did everything I did.
Were you mad at your boss?
No.
So that first one was definitely disorganized speech. In fact, that was basically word salad. A lot of what she said didn't really make that much sense and usually didn't relate to any part of the question that was asked. The second guy was a little bit more of disorganized behavior, which in part was probably coming from whoever was talking to him about these rounds, because it's kind of hard to just get up and quit your job, but certainly that is unusual. But he obviously was less disorganized speech because he kind of, I mean, he made sense. Now, whoever was talking to him didn't necessarily make any sense, so maybe that was also a little bit of disorganized speech as well. But the first person was basically the absolute example of a person that has very, very disorganized everything, and that word salad that can be very, very characteristic. As I mentioned about those whole positive symptoms, there are also negative symptoms, which mean something is taken away, basically. That first one, anhedonia, that is basically a lack of being able to enjoy things, lack of pleasure, lack of interest, that type of thing. So so that it kind of shares with depression, but that is a lack of interest. There's also a motivation. No, I don't. Again, a or an usually refers to lack, so they don't really have that much. They might not have motivation. A flat affect. So when you're discussing affect, you're really looking at the person and how much kind of like expression that they have. The girl in the video was pretty flat. There was nothing going on. She as far as her face was concerned, she really didn't have that much emotion or expression or anything like that. She didn't smile, she didn't frown, she just was. You can, some might say she had, what's called resting bitch face, quote unquote, and that can also sometimes be mistaken for a flat affect, but doesn't necessarily mean that person has schizophrenia. There might be other reasons why they just don't show much. Maybe they're choosing not to, for example. There's also this one, alogia, which is basically reduced speech. They might, in fact, be basically mute if they so desire to be that way. That is also an option. Now, schizophrenia has a lot of challenges that can come up with cognition. For example, they're going to have issues with their episodic memory. Now, if you remember what episodic memory is, it is this concept of an episode basically in a person's life. Maybe how they had dinner that day, who they had it with, just a little scene. Now, this can be affected with them because they may have some type of hallucination or delusion. Certainly can change what they encoded, or it could adjust itself, of course, after the fact as well. Working memory, their working memory will tend to decrease. That is partially because the brain is just trying to juggle so many things, and if it's also dealing with these other issues, that might be taking away some of the processing power that could be used to deal with something in a more short-term working memory type basis. Processing speed can certainly decrease, as well. Now, the cognitive defects are a risk for schizophrenia. They don't cause it. But if you are seeing some of these challenges and somebody goes to a psychologist, they may choose to test for schizophrenia just in case, because usually they're present before things start getting bad. They might ask people to take the MMPI, which is a psychological test where people try to, fairly long test. They try to figure out what disorders might be, on the radar. And one of the ones that it can detect is schizophrenia. So risk factors for this, of course, there are genetic factors. There is not a specific schizophrenia gene. It may have several genetic components, but that is at least some of the things that we know. We are really trying, the researchers are really trying to learn more about it, so hopefully they can maybe better treat it, or maybe they can repair the gene or something like that. Since they do know that some of the genes, they just don't know how all of them interplay. Some of those genes that they do have are linked to a lot of other conditions, bipolar, depression, autism. That does not mean that every schizophrenic has autism, or every autistic person has schizophrenia, or any of the spectrum. I do happen to know one autistic person with schizophrenia, but that of all the autistic people I know, he is the only one. Likewise, I don't know any people that have both the schizophrenia and depression diagnosis. I'm sure you can, but or same with bipolar. So nobody really knows what specifically is going on with all of that, and how it might trigger one as opposed to a different disorder. Other risk factors for schizophrenia include various environmental causes. That could be problems during pregnancy. When they say problems, that actually could be a variety of things, and that could be malnutrition type of things, excessive maternal stress, anything that could cause an issue. Issues with possible complications at birth, maybe something like preeclampsia or something like that. While a lot of disorders are linked to advanced maternal age, schizophrenia is linked to advanced paternal age. So if somebody's father is significantly older, they very well are maybe at greater risk of developing schizophrenia. In addition, as we mentioned, cannabis use, it's more likely to push you over. Urban settings as opposed to rural settings. This could be due to something like the stress that can cause issues. It might be something else entirely. Being an ethnic minority, at least in the U.S., low SES, of course, being poor. So we now getting into the treatment of schizophrenia. There are two general ways people are trying to treat it via medication. And that includes the typical antipsychotics and the atypical antipsychotics. So the typical ones, because we do know that schizophrenia is linked to an excessive amount of dopamine, this is actually trying to block one of the dopamine receptors, which will calm things down. The atypical antipsychotics do a lot of other things. So one of the challenges with blocking dopamine is if you block too much, then you end up developing like Parkinson's disease, and that can be problematic as well. But there are a large variety of medications. One of them includes Haldol, which is a very common one to be prescribed. And I know several situations where maybe people don't remember what medication they're on, but they know they take a psychiatric medication, and they'll just say, oh, I remember it starts with an H. And if somebody ever says that, we're going to pretty much assume that it is likely Haldol. We will make that we'll say, is it Haldol? And more often than not, they do say, yeah, that one's it. Haldol is, again, a typical antipsychotic, and it's been around for a very, very long time. When people go off any of these medications, bad things start to happen. My stepmother was, like I said, was on Haldol, and things did not go well when she decided to stop taking it. She ended up with a lot of hallucinations and delusions, and pretty much destroyed multiple families during that time. During actually a very, very short week, a few weeks, and it's been over 20 years, and we're still actually dealing with the damage from it. So those are some things. Also, interesting fact about Haldol is it basically makes you practically a vampire, because you can't go out into the sun because you burn so very easily. So, fun fact. There is also at least one type of therapy that is sometimes used with the treatment of schizophrenia. At this time, I'm really not an expert on any of this, and I've never met anybody who has used this for people who have schizophrenia. But I can at least say a little bit about it. Maybe in the future I can redo this lecture and finally give more information. But this is supposed to be a cognitive remediation treatment, which prevents the loss of gray matter, which would basically keep the brain from kind of collapsing on itself. And it is supposed to improve cognition of various forms. So at least some of the cognitive deficits will improve. Potentially other things will improve as well. So here are some discussion questions. How could different cultures interpret the symptoms of schizophrenia? If you watched some of my previous lectures, it would not surprise you to know that people that have this disorder in other cultures are frequently looked up to. They're actually looked up to as prophets, shamans, medicine men, all those types of things. They are treated like they have no disorder. They're only treated like they have an unusual disorder in basically the United States, and in a few other countries as well. But most countries actually have this type of thing already kind of built in, and people that have this challenge are thought of as very, very useful members of society. Sometimes they're some of the most important members of society. So there have been several cases of anthropologists or psychologists going down to a group I shouldn't have said anthropologists because anthropologists don't tend to do that type of thing. But psychologists come down to the group and try to impose a Western idea of what these people have on this group of people. So they said, oh, they're all schizophrenic, and no, they would look at our culture and say, all the schizophrenic people with schizophrenia are in fact maybe shamans or something like that. So how does it manifest itself in terms of symptoms, ability to work, and ability to interact with others? Well, there are a lot of potential things that it could do. It can certainly make communication more challenging, especially if you have disorganized speech. The delusions and hallucinations can certainly cause a lot of disruption, especially when one person is saying maybe somebody else said something when it was really some type of delusion or hallucination. But each one of those things can really impact somebody's life, and that's one of the things with the diagnosis. It really should create some form of functional impairment. And a lot of people, might have challenges working after this develops. My stepmother had 2 master's degrees. She was a therapist. She should know better. But yet, this came into her life, and she did not do nearly as well after that. So schizophrenics are people with schizophrenia. I probably shouldn't have said it's schizophrenic like that, but I actually grabbed that from something else. But they are known for going off medication. At what point should somebody, or somehow, maybe a government agency, I don't know, force medication, if at all? That's something that could be taken up with any form of ethical discussion or debate. So those are at least a few for you. So if anybody has any questions or anything like that, I am super easy to find. Call me, email me, drop me a comment, and I will try to get back to you. Thank you.